Adam stepped onto the campus of Eastbrook Community College, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of a backpack that held his sparse belongings, and the heavy burden of a past he was desperate to leave behind. The fall air was crisp, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and the muted chatter of students moving through the quad. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating underground world he'd left. Back there, he had been known as Liam, a name that was feared, one that sent shivers down spines. Liam had been a force, a violent, controlled weapon. But here, Adam was just a man with an empty notebook and a secret he was fighting to keep buried. Inside the main hall, students rushed between classes, laughter and conversations blending in a way that felt strangely foreign to him. Adam kept his head down, gripping the straps of his backpack, willing himself to blend in. He hadn't expected the shadows of his past to feel so close here, yet they clung to him like a second skin he couldn't shed. As he found his seat in the back of the lecture hall, he felt the familiar itch of paranoia. The whispers of his past life crept into his mind, flashes of images he couldn't shake, a mission gone wrong, an innocent caught in the crossfire, a decision he could never undo. He shut his eyes, taking a deep breath, fighting the urge to bolt. "Focus," he whispered to himself, clenching his fists under the desk. "You're here to disappear." Yet, as the days passed, it became clear that disappearing at Eastbrook would be harder than he thought. There were rules here, but they weren't written in the school's handbook. The unspoken authority belonged to a gang that called themselves the Cobras, led by Marcos, a young thug who commanded loyalty through fear. Adam saw them everywhere, in the cafeteria, the library, and even outside the main building, where they prowled in packs, singling out students who seemed vulnerable. The Cobras operated with impunity, and the administration, afraid or unwilling to confront them, turned a blind eye. Adam watched from the sidelines, trying to ignore the tension tightening his muscles whenever he saw the Cobras corner someone. But his instincts were tuned for survival. He could sense the same primal hunger in Marcos that he once recognized in himself, a hunger for power, for control. He forced himself to stay uninvolved, reminding himself of why he'd come here. This was his chance to live without violence, to leave behind the brutal skills he'd spent years mastering. But the darkness he'd tried to leave behind didn't seem to want to let him go. One rainy afternoon, as Adam walked through a quiet corridor, he heard a muffled voice, a young woman's voice, trembling. He turned a corner and saw her, a petite girl with wide, terrified eyes, her back pressed against a wall. Sarah. He'd seen her in the cafeteria before, always sitting alone with her headphones on, shrinking into herself whenever anyone walked by. Now, she was cornered by Marcos and two of his gang members, her face pale with fear as she clutched her notebook to her chest like a shield. Marcos smirked, tilting his head as he leaned in. "What's the rush, huh?" he taunted, his voice oozing with fake charm. "You always in such a hurry? Relax a little." One of his lackeys snickered, inching closer. Sarah's gaze darted around, but the hallway was deserted. Adam knew he should keep walking, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something inside him twisted, pulling him back to memories he'd tried to forget. Memories of helpless faces and his own ruthless actions. He had been both predator and prey in his life, but he'd never stood by and watched an innocent suffer. Taking a deep breath, he weighed his options. He couldn't confront Marcos directly, not without risking exposure. But he could create a distraction. He walked purposefully over to a nearby vending machine and, with a quick movement, jammed his knee into it. The machine rattled loudly, the noise echoing through the empty hallway, startling Marcos and his gang. They looked over, momentarily thrown off balance, and in that split second, Sarah seized the opportunity. She slipped around Marcos, darting down the corridor without a backward glance. Marcos's face darkened as he turned to look at Adam, who was now staring intently at a soda can that had fallen from the machine. "What's your problem, man?" Marcos sneered, his eyes narrowing. Adam shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Just thirsty," he replied, bending to pick up the can. He felt the eyes of Marcos's lackeys on him, assessing, but he forced himself to stay calm, nonchalant. Marcos lingered for a moment, his gaze filled with suspicion, before finally muttering something under his breath and walking away with his crew. As they disappeared around the corner, Adam let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The danger had passed, for now, but he knew he'd drawn unwanted attention. Marcos was the kind of predator who could sense weakness, and Adam's intervention had piqued his interest. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time Adam closed his eyes, fragments of his past bled into his thoughts, the faces of those he'd wronged, the empty eyes of his victims. But something else tugged at him, too, the memory of Sarah's terrified expression, the relief that flooded her face as she'd escaped. For the first time in a long while, Adam felt a spark of purpose, a glimmer of something that felt almost like redemption. The next morning, as he entered his classroom, he noticed a familiar face watching him from across the room. It was Professor Henderson, an older man with warm eyes and an air of quiet authority. Adam had sensed early on that Henderson saw more than he let on, that he was the type of person who looked beneath the surface. After class, Henderson stopped him with a gentle smile. "Adam," he began, his voice soft but firm, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The words were simple, but they cut through Adam's defenses, striking a part of him he'd tried to bury. For a brief moment, he considered opening up, telling Henderson about his past, about the weight he carried. But the fear of judgment, of rejection, held him back. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady but distant. He nodded and turned away, feeling the warmth of the professor's gaze on his back as he walked out. Days passed, and Adam kept his distance, blending into the shadows, hoping his intervention had gone unnoticed. But he sensed the change. Marcos was watching him, lurking on the edges of his vision, his presence a constant reminder of the danger Adam faced if his past were uncovered. For now, he would continue to walk the tightrope, balancing his desire to disappear with the pull of his old instincts. But deep down, he knew that his path to redemption was a fragile one. One wrong step, and everything he'd tried to build could come crashing down. And as the shadows of his past closed in, Adam began to realize that his journey at Eastbrook was just beginning, and that the ghosts he tried to escape were closer than he'd ever imagined. Adam's efforts to stay invisible were already slipping. Every day, he felt Marcos's gaze on him, like a hunter observing prey. The tension gnawed at him, inching closer to the surface each time he caught the cobras watching him from across the quad, whispering and smirking in his direction. The encounter in the hallway with Sarah had lit a fuse, and Adam sensed it was only a matter of time before things would erupt. His only hope was to stay one step ahead, to avoid sparking the kind of violence he'd come here to leave behind. But as much as Adam tried to remain detached, two people were quietly closing the distance between them and the guarded stranger he had become. It started with Sarah. She approached him one afternoon in the library, her steps hesitant, glancing around as if expecting Marcos and his gang to emerge from the shadows. She was clutching a notebook tightly, and as she walked closer, Adam noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "Hi, Adam," she said, her voice soft but firm. She sat down across from him before he could respond, her gaze darting around before settling on him. I wanted to thank you for, what you did that day." Adam shrugged, trying to appear casual, though he felt the weight of her gratitude and fear. "I just happened to be there," he replied, his voice low. Sarah's lips pressed into a faint smile. "I don't believe that. You didn't have to help me. And, well, not many people stand up to Marcos." She hesitated, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "If you're not careful, he'll come after you. You know that, right?" Adam nodded, feigning calm, though her warning only confirmed his suspicions. "I'm used to handling myself," he said, hoping it would end the conversation. But Sarah wasn't done. "I know what it's like," she continued, her voice softer, "to have people come after you, to feel like you're always looking over your shoulder." She paused, her expression tight as if she were weighing how much to reveal. But I didn't always handle myself well. Sometimes, it helps to know someone's out there who understands. Adam looked at her, surprised. There was a pain in her eyes that mirrored his own, a history of battles fought and lost, scars that weren't visible but ran deep. Her quiet strength stirred something in him, a sense of solidarity that he hadn't felt in years. He realized, with a pang of unease, that he didn't want Sarah to be drawn into his orbit of danger. But his silence must have conveyed something, because she simply nodded, giving him a small, understanding smile before slipping away, leaving him alone with a strange sense of connection he hadn't expected. Not long after, another presence entered his life, though this one came with more resistance. David, a wiry young man with a sharp gaze, had been a frequent target of the Cobras. Unlike Sarah, he met Marcos's provocations with clenched fists and barely contained rage, making himself an easy mark for punishment. He was one of the few students who had fought back, even if it meant getting bruised and battered for it. One day, Adam found himself in the student lounge when David, his lips split and his knuckles red, stormed in. David's gaze locked onto Adam, who was sitting in the corner, eyes half closed as if trying to shut out the world. But David wasn't fooled. "Hey, I've seen what you did for Sarah," David said, his tone edged with accusation but laced with admiration. "You think you can just pull something like that and not get involved? Marcos isn't someone you can just ignore." Adam sat up, meeting David's gaze. "I wasn't looking to get involved," he replied evenly. "But that doesn't mean I'll sit by and watch." David studied him, his eyes narrowing as if trying to peel back the layers of mystery surrounding Adam. "Yeah, I don't buy that. You're hiding something. You're different." He crossed his arms, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "I know people who can throw a punch, but you move like someone who's done it a lot." Adam's jaw tightened, and for a moment he considered walking away, leaving David with his questions. But he knew that running would only heighten suspicion. He had to control the narrative. "I had a rough past," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "But I'm here to change that, to stay out of trouble." David tilted his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, well, I don't think trouble is going to stay away from you. Not with Marcos sniffing around." Adam stayed silent, but David's words sank in. He could feel the truth in them like an approaching storm. Marcos wouldn't let things slide. He would keep pushing, keep probing, and sooner or later, Adam would have to confront him head-on. Over the next few weeks, the bond between Adam, Sarah, and David grew, though it was tinged with unspoken fears and suspicions. Sarah found herself gravitating toward Adam, drawn to the quiet strength he exuded. She started joining him in the library, sometimes speaking in hushed tones, other times simply sitting in silence, a calm presence beside him. David, however, was more confrontational. He would pepper Adam with questions, probing him for answers, challenging him at every turn. "Why do you keep watching them?" he'd ask, pointing at the cobras across the quad. "If you want to stay out of trouble, why can't you just let them be?" But Adam's silence only deepened David's curiosity, and it wasn't long before he started piecing things together. One afternoon, as they sat outside on a quiet part of campus, David finally spoke up. "I don't know who you really are, Adam," he said, his voice laced with intensity, "but I know you're not just some random guy. You've been watching them. You've been protecting us. And it's only a matter of time before someone finds out." Adam's fists tightened, his heart pounding with the weight of David's words. "Why does it matter?" he replied, his voice low. "You're safe. That's all that matters." David shook his head, frustration etched on his face. "That's not good enough. You're hiding something, and it's putting all of us at risk. If Marcos catches on, if he realizes you're not who you say you are." Adam didn't let him finish. "David, enough," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I came here to escape my past, to start over. But if protecting you too means risking my cover, then so be it." I can't change who I was, but I can decide who I am now." The words hung heavy in the air, and David's expression softened, a glint of understanding passing between them. For the first time, Adam saw a hint of trust in his eyes, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, they were on the same side. But just as Adam thought he might have gained an ally, the fragile peace was shattered. That night, as he walked across campus, he noticed a figure waiting by the lamppost outside his dormitory. Marcos stood there, his arms crossed, a dark smile on his face. "So, you think you're some kind of hero?" Marcos sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Saving the weak, hiding in the shadows, thinking I wouldn't notice?" Adam's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcos laughed, a low, menacing sound. "Oh, I think you do. I know your type. You pretend you're better than the rest of us, but you're not. You think you can play games with me?" He leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Well, let's see how long you last." With a final piercing glare, Marcos walked away, leaving Adam alone in the dark, his words echoing in the silence. Adam knew the game had changed. He had tried to avoid conflict, to walk a careful line between intervention and anonymity, but now the stakes had risen. Marcos was coming for him, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered every secret Adam had tried to bury. As Adam watched Marcos disappear into the shadows, he felt the familiar pull of his old instincts, the part of him that had been Liam, the ruthless, calculated weapon who didn't hesitate to eliminate threats. He could feel that part of himself clawing to break free, to protect his friends by any means necessary. But he couldn't go back. Not after everything he'd fought to leave behind. In the dim light, Adam took a deep breath, steeling himself. He would have to find a new way to fight, a way that wouldn't destroy everything he was trying to become. Because this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, about proving to himself that he could protect without resorting to the darkness. And as he turned and walked into the night, he knew that his journey was only beginning, and the real battle had yet to come. Adam's world at Eastbrook was closing in. Every day felt like a test of his resolve to keep the darkness of his past at bay, but Marcos was relentless. The Cobras had become his shadows, their eyes tracking his every move as if they could peel back his layers just by watching. And Adam knew the moment was coming when he'd have to make a choice. Stay silent or take a stand that could reveal everything he was trying to hide. The tension spiked one afternoon in the campus library. Adam was sitting alone, his eyes scanning the room from behind a book he wasn't actually reading. He noticed David enter, his face tense, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Without warning, David marched toward Adam's table and dropped into the seat across from him, ignoring the curious glances of other students nearby. "We need to talk," David said, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp as a blade. Adam tensed, giving a quick glance around. "Keep your voice down." David leaned in, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and something like betrayal. "Marcos is pushing harder than ever. He's been grilling people, asking questions about you. People are talking, Adam. They know there's something different about you." Adam felt the ground shift beneath him, but he kept his voice steady. "They're just rumors. It doesn't mean anything." David shook his head. "Not to Marcos. He's got this twisted need to dominate everyone around him, and you're in his way. You need to be careful." David's face softened for a moment, as if he was wrestling with something unsaid. "Or better yet, maybe you need to leave before it gets worse." Adam's hands clenched under the table. "You think running is the answer?" David looked away, his shoulders tense. "I think protecting yourself is the answer. You're hiding something, Adam. And whatever it is, Marcos is going to drag it out of you. And it's not just about you anymore. It's about Sarah, too." Adam froze, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Marcos started harassing her again yesterday, pressing her for information. He's looking for a weak link, someone he can exploit to get to you. She's scared, Adam. And so am I. The weight of David's words settled heavily on Adam. He had tried so hard to shield his friends, to keep his past locked away. But he realized now that his silence was no longer a defense. It had become a liability, a weapon that Marcos was wielding against the people Adam cared about. His every instinct told him to fight back, to confront Marcos and end this once and for all. But he knew that revealing his skills would only confirm the rumors, unleashing a storm he couldn't control. That night, he couldn't sleep. As he lay in the dark, fragments of his old life surfaced. Brutal missions, his own hands covered in blood, the cold satisfaction he'd once felt from winning, from taking down anyone who stood in his way. But there were other memories, too. The quiet pleas of those caught in the crossfire, the weight of lives shattered by his decisions. And now, for the first time, he felt that same guilt here. In this life he had fought so hard to build anew. By morning, Adam had made a decision. He would confront Marcos, but in a way that wouldn't reveal his past. If he could somehow shake the gang's confidence, show them that he wasn't afraid, perhaps he could defuse the situation without raising more suspicion. As the day wore on, he noticed Marcos in his usual spot near the student quad, lounging on a bench with his lieutenants. They were laughing, watching students pass by with the detached amusement of predators studying their prey. Adam walked over, keeping his face calm, though his insides were churning with tension. Marcos noticed him, a smirk spreading across his face. "Well, look who's brave enough to come over and say hi," he sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Adam stopped a few feet away, his stance relaxed but his eyes steely. "We need to talk, Marcos." The gang leader leaned back, chuckling. "Oh, you got something to say, hero?" Adam ignored the taunt. "I don't know what your game is, but it ends here. Sarah, David, they're off limits. This campus isn't yours to control." Marcos's smirk faltered, a flicker of annoyance flashing in his eyes. "You think you're in any position to tell me what to do?" he said, his voice hardening. He stood, taking a step closer to Adam, his gaze cold and calculating. "You may think you're someone special, but you're just another loser trying to act tough." Adam met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe. But you're the one hiding behind your goons, pushing people around because you know they're scared of you. Without them, you're just a coward looking for a fight you can't win." The silence that followed was thick, tense. The students who had overheard the exchange had stopped in their tracks, watching the standoff with wide eyes. Marcos's smirk faded entirely, replaced by a glare that promised retribution. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he hissed. "But you'll find out soon enough." With that, Marcos turned and stormed off, his lieutenants close behind, casting dark looks at Adam. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmurs rippling through the students who had witnessed the exchange. Adam felt the stares on him, the whispers as people speculated about who he really was. He could feel his carefully crafted anonymity unraveling, thread by thread. Later that day, as he was leaving campus, Adam noticed Sarah waiting for him near the edge of the parking lot. Her face was pale, her arms crossed tightly as if bracing against an invisible threat. "Adam," she said, her voice laced with worry, "why did you do that? Now Marcos is going to be even more relentless. He's already threatened David, and now you've put yourself in his sights." Adam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't stand by and watch him hurt you. I thought if I confronted him, he might back off." Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "You don't get it. He won't back off. He'll push until he breaks you, or worse." For a moment, Adam considered telling her everything, the truth about his past, about why he'd come here, about the weight he carried every day. But he held back, knowing that revealing too much would only put her in more danger. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "I'll handle it, Sarah," he promised. "Just trust me." That night, as he walked home, he felt an eerie sense of calm settle over him, as if his mind had accepted the inevitability of a confrontation with Marcos. He was done hiding, done watching his friends suffer for the sake of his secrecy. And as he walked through the dark streets, he sensed a presence behind him, footsteps echoing in time with his own. He turned sharply, his hand reflexively reaching for the knife he no longer carried. In the dim light of the street lamp, he saw one of Marcos's lieutenants, a tall, wiry guy with a scar across his cheek, watching him with a cold, calculating gaze. "Got a message for you, Adam," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "Marcos wants to see you. Tonight." Adam's jaw clenched, but he kept his expression calm. "Tell him I'll be there." The man gave a twisted smile, tipping an imaginary hat before melting back into the shadows. Adam watched him go, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. The confrontation he'd been dreading was here, and he knew that whatever happened next would define not only his future at Eastbrook, but his very chance at redemption. For the first time, Adam felt the full weight of his past pushing against him, whispering that the only way to end this was to unleash the violence he had buried deep within. But as he walked toward his meeting with Marcos, he vowed to himself that he wouldn't go back to that life. Not completely. Whatever happened tonight, he would find a way to protect his friends and keep his promise to himself. Because this time, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to become the man he wanted to be. And in the shadows, Marcos waited, ready to force him to confront the darkness he'd tried so hard to escape. The old, abandoned factory stood on the outskirts of town, its walls covered in graffiti, its windows shattered, and the roof sagging from years of neglect. Adam walked slowly through the shadows, his steps almost silent as he approached the meeting spot. Every instinct screamed caution, but he forced himself forward, knowing that this confrontation was inevitable. Marcos had set the terms, and Adam's only option now was to play along, for the safety of Sarah and David, and for the chance to end this game before it spiraled further out of control. The silence inside the factory was heavy, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the rusted pipes overhead. He scanned the darkness, every muscle on high alert, cataloging possible exits and calculating angles, just as he'd done in his old life. This was familiar ground. Too familiar. He could feel the sharp edges of his past self rising within him, Liam's instincts slipping back into place, ready to do whatever it took. In the center of the dimly lit room, Marcos waited, flanked by two of his lieutenants, their faces hard, each one wearing a twisted smile that sent a clear message. They'd been waiting for this. And behind them, tied to a chair with his mouth taped, sat David, his eyes wide with fear. His cheek was bruised, a thin line of blood trickling down from a fresh cut above his eyebrow. Adam's heart clenched at the sight, but he kept his face cold and expressionless. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not here, not now. "Well, well," Marcos sneered, taking a few casual steps toward Adam. "I thought maybe you'd run off, hero. But here you are, ready to play. Or should I say, fight." His voice dripped with mockery, but there was an underlying tension in his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty. Adam had seen it before, the look of a man who knew he might be in over his head but was too proud to back down. Adam's gaze flickered to David, then back to Marcos. "Let him go," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is between you and me. He has nothing to do with it." Marcos laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "Oh, but he has everything to do with it. See, you made the mistake of sticking your nose where it didn't belong. And now, well, now I get to show everyone what happens when you cross me." He leaned in, his face inches from Adam's. "So here's the deal, tough guy. Either you admit you're nothing, just another scared, pathetic wannabe, or," he glanced back at David, a sadistic glint in his eyes, "or I make an example out of him." Adam felt a surge of fury rise within him, but he forced it down, keeping his expression impassive. He knew Marcos was baiting him, pushing him to lash out. But giving in would only prove to Marcos that he was the threat the gang leader already suspected him to be. He had to stay in control, even if every fiber of his being screamed for him to act. But Marcos wasn't done. He took a step back, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "I'm going to give you a chance to save him, hero. Let's see if you've got what it takes." He nodded at his men, who immediately advanced on Adam, their knuckles cracking, eyes glinting with anticipation. Adam stood his ground, letting his mind slip into the cold clarity he hadn't used in years. As the first man lunged, Adam dodged to the side, grabbing his attacker's wrist and twisting sharply, using his momentum to flip him onto the ground. The man grunted in pain as he hit the concrete, and before he could recover, Adam delivered a precise blow to his shoulder, immobilizing him without causing permanent damage. The second thug charged in, swinging a metal pipe. Adam sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike, then delivered a quick elbow to the man's side, knocking the wind out of him. With a calculated sweep of his leg, he sent the man crashing to the floor, the pipe clattering from his hand. Marcos's smirk faltered as he watched his men go down so effortlessly. He took a step back, visibly shaken. But he quickly masked his fear with bravado, drawing a knife from his belt and pointing it at Adam. "So, you really are something, aren't you?" Marcos sneered, his voice dripping with a mix of envy and anger. "Who are you, really? Some kind of ex-soldier? A killer pretending to be a good guy?" Adam didn't answer. His eyes locked onto Marcos's, cold and unyielding. "You don't need to know who I am," he said, his voice like steel. "But I can tell you one thing, you're out of your depth." Marcos's hand tightened around the knife, his knuckles white. "We'll see about that." He lunged forward, slashing wildly. Adam sidestepped, his movements controlled, calculated. He waited for Marcos to overcommit, then stepped in, grabbing Marcos's wrist and twisting it with just enough force to make him drop the knife. Marcos stumbled back, rage and humiliation darkening his expression. "You think you can walk in here and make a fool of me?" he spat. "I own this place. I own this campus." Adam felt the anger bubbling up again, the old instincts urging him to put an end to this once and for all. But he held back, knowing that the line he walked was razor thin. If he crossed it, he would risk not only his own life but the fragile future he'd built here. Instead, he grabbed Marcos by the collar, pulling him close enough that their faces were inches apart. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a cold menace that sent a chill down Marcos's spine. "You're done terrorizing this campus. You're done hurting people. And if I ever see you go near Sarah or David again, I'll make sure you never forget what happened here." He released Marcos with a final shove, sending him stumbling backward. For a moment, Marcos looked ready to retaliate, his fists clenched, his face twisted with fury. But as he looked into Adam's eyes, something shifted. A flicker of fear passed over him, a realization that he was facing someone far more dangerous than he had anticipated. He swallowed, his bravado crumbling, before he motioned to his men. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice hollow. He turned and disappeared into the shadows, his lieutenants following close behind, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. As the silence settled over the factory, Adam turned to David, quickly moving to untie him. David's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, but a flicker of gratitude shone through the fear. You didn't have to do that," David whispered, his voice shaky as he rubbed his wrists, red from the ropes. "Yes, I did," Adam replied, his tone soft but firm. "I'm not going to let him hurt you or anyone else. Not anymore." David looked at him, a mixture of awe and confusion in his gaze. "Adam, who are you? Really?" Adam paused, the weight of the question pressing down on him. For a moment, he considered telling David the full truth, about the life he'd left behind, about the things he'd done. But he knew that burden was his alone to carry. "I'm just someone trying to make up for past mistakes," he said finally. "Someone trying to do the right thing, for once." They left the factory in silence, the cold night air washing over them as they stepped outside. Adam's heart was still racing, but he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that he'd protected his friends without giving in to the darkness that had once consumed him. As they walked, David broke the silence, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Thank you, Adam. For everything." Adam nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He knew that this wasn't the end, that Marcos wouldn't let this defeat go unanswered, that his past still lurked like a shadow waiting to reclaim him. But for now, he had a measure of control, a chance to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And as they walked into the night, Adam felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but growing sense that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life worth living. A life where he didn't have to hide, a life where he could finally find redemption. But in the depths of his mind, he knew that the fight wasn't over. Marcos would return, and so would the shadows. And when they did, Adam would be ready. In the days following the confrontation at the factory, a tense calm settled over Eastbrook's campus. The Cobras had vanished, and Marcos was nowhere to be seen, but Adam knew better than to believe the threat was over. Marcos was cunning, and Adam had humiliated him in front of his own men. That wasn't something a guy like Marcos would ever let go. He would return, and when he did, Adam knew he'd have to be ready. But for now, a quiet peace reigned. Students moved through the halls without casting nervous glances over their shoulders, and even David seemed more at ease, though a flicker of uncertainty lingered in his eyes whenever he looked at Adam. Then there was Sarah. She had sought him out several times since the factory incident, her voice laced with gratitude and curiosity. But her questions, gentle as they were, became harder to dodge. Adam could feel her edging closer to the truth, each conversation bringing them to a precarious line that he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. One afternoon, Professor Henderson approached Adam after class, a concerned look in his eyes. "Adam," he began quietly, "I heard about what happened with Marcos and his gang. Word spreads fast around here, and the students seem to think you're some sort of campus hero." He gave Adam a small, approving smile, but it was tinged with worry. "I know you've been trying to stay in the shadows, but maybe it's time you consider doing something different. Something that could give you a real purpose here." Adam frowned, unsure of what Henderson was getting at. "What do you mean?" Henderson's expression softened, his tone fatherly. "You have a way of connecting with the students who feel isolated, those who might be struggling. I've been thinking, the college needs someone who can guide students who've lost their way. A mentor, someone who understands what it's like to carry a heavy past." The words hit Adam like a punch. Him, a mentor? The irony wasn't lost on him. Someone who had spent most of his life hurting people was now being asked to help them. He wanted to dismiss the idea, to shake his head and walk away, but Henderson's gaze held him steady, full of a faith Adam didn't believe he deserved. "You've done good here, Adam," Henderson continued, his voice gentle. "I know you've got a history, things you're not proud of. We all do. But you've taken steps to change. And maybe this is your chance to do something that really matters." Adam looked away, his mind churning. The idea of becoming a mentor stirred something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond survival. But he was haunted by the fear that one day, his past would catch up with him, undoing everything he tried to rebuild. "I'll think about it," Adam said finally, his voice low, almost uncertain. Henderson nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "Take your time. Just know that whatever you decide, you have support here. From me, and from others who believe in second chances." Adam left the classroom with a strange sense of calm, Henderson's words lingering in his mind. Could he really find redemption by helping others? Could he actually be a force for good, rather than destruction? But as the days passed, his doubts returned. The more he thought about taking on a public role, the more he feared exposure. He wasn't just any ex-criminal. He was Liam, a name that, in certain circles, still carried a dark reputation. And if anyone from his past recognized him, everything he'd worked to protect would be shattered. Then, one night, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The message was simple, a chilling threat that turned his blood to ice. If you want to protect your friends, meet me at the train yard. Midnight. Adam's pulse raced. He knew it had to be Marcos. The last confrontation had been brutal, but Marcos wasn't the type to take defeat lying down. Adam took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for what lay ahead. He couldn't let anyone else get hurt because of him, and if that meant facing Marcos one final time, so be it. At midnight, Adam arrived at the old train yard, the cold air cutting through his jacket as he moved silently through the shadows. The place was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of metal. He scanned the area, his instincts sharp, honed from years of survival. A figure emerged from the darkness. Marcos, flanked by two of his most loyal followers. The gang leader's face was twisted with hatred, his eyes narrowed in cold determination. "So, you actually showed up," Marcos sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist. Hero types like you always think they can solve everything by showing up." Adam met his gaze, his expression calm but cold. "This ends here, Marcos. I'm done with your threats. Leave Sarah and David out of this. They're innocent. You've already done enough." Marcos chuckled, a sinister glint in his eyes. "Innocent," he mocked. "There's no such thing as innocent, not in my world. And certainly not in yours." He stepped closer, studying Adam's face with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Who are you, really? Because I don't buy this good guy act. You don't fight like someone who's just trying to survive. You fight like you've done this before." Adam's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay still, to remain calm. "Whatever you think you know, it doesn't matter. Walk away, Marcos, before this goes somewhere you can't come back from." But Marcos only laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Oh, I think I'm just getting started." He signaled to his men, and they moved forward, circling Adam with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Adam took a deep breath, his mind slipping into a place he had vowed never to return to. But this time, he would have to find a way to protect without unleashing the darkness that lurked within him. He moved quickly, sidestepping the first man's punch and twisting his arm back, dislocating it with a calculated strike. The second man lunged, but Adam dodged and delivered a swift blow to his ribs, sending him sprawling. Marcos watched, his face contorted with rage, but a flicker of fear had appeared in his eyes. He could see that Adam wasn't like the others, that he fought with a precision and control that came from years of training. And for the first time, Marcos realized he was facing someone far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Enough games, Marcos," Adam said, his voice steely. "This is your last chance. Leave me and my friends alone, or you won't like what happens next." But Marcos sneered, pulling a gun from his jacket, his hand shaking slightly as he aimed it at Adam. "You don't scare me, hero," he spat. "I'm not the one who's out of his depth here." Adam's body tensed, his mind racing. He knew that any sudden movement would end badly. He met Marcos's gaze, his own steady, filled with a determination that sent a clear message. He wasn't afraid to face whatever came next. "Put the gun down, Marcos," Adam said slowly, his voice calm, measured. "This doesn't have to end like this." Marcos's hand wavered, a flicker of doubt passing over his face. But his pride, his need for power, overrode any hesitation. With a snarl, he squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty train yard, a violent crack that seemed to hang in the air. Adam moved just in time, the bullet grazing his shoulder as he threw himself to the side, the pain sharp but manageable. He rolled, then sprang to his feet, his eyes blazing. In a swift, decisive move, Adam closed the distance between them, disarming Marcos with a twist of his wrist that sent the gun clattering to the ground. He pinned Marcos against the wall, his face inches from the gang leaders, his voice low and deadly. "This is over, Marcos," he hissed. "If you come near me or my friends again, I'll make sure you regret it." Marcos's face twisted with fury, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Adam released him with a final shove, and Marcos stumbled back, his bravado shattered. Without a word, he turned and fled, his men following, casting fearful glances back at Adam as they disappeared into the night. Adam stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly fading as the reality of what had just happened settled over him. He had won, but at a cost. The wound on his shoulder throbbed, a painful reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. As he walked away from the train yard, Adam knew that the confrontation had changed everything. Marcos was defeated, but the risk of exposure was greater than ever. His actions tonight had proven to anyone watching that he wasn't just an ordinary student, that he was something else entirely. But despite the danger, a strange sense of peace washed over him. For the first time, he felt like he had faced his past without letting it consume him. And as he looked up at the stars, he allowed himself a rare moment of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live without fear. But he knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, and the shadows of his past would always be close. Yet, for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. The campus felt different now. Since that night at the train yard, Eastbrook had regained a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. The Cobras had disbanded, and Marcos's reign of terror had come to an end. Rumors circulated that he had quietly left town, humiliated by his defeat and fearful of the consequences if he stayed. For Adam, the relief was immense. He had finally closed a dark chapter without sacrificing the progress he'd made. Adam walked across the quad, his shoulders still sore but healing. He moved carefully, conscious of the students around him who now greeted him with shy smiles or respectful nods. Word had spread about his actions, though the details remained blurred by rumor. Some said he'd fought off an entire gang single-handedly. Others speculated he'd been part of some secret agency before coming to Eastbrook. Adam ignored the whispers, keeping his interactions brief and his gaze forward, though he felt a strange warmth growing within him. Acceptance, something he'd never believed he'd find. One afternoon, Professor Henderson called him into his office, his face lit with a proud smile as Adam entered. "Adam," Henderson began, leaning back in his chair, "I've been hearing about the changes around campus. Students feel safe again, and I think we both know who deserves the credit for that." Adam shook his head, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I was just trying to do the right thing. That's all." Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "You've done far more than that. You've shown these students what it means to stand up against intimidation, to act selflessly." He paused, studying Adam with the same careful, understanding gaze he'd held since they'd first met. "You know, my offer still stands." Adam hesitated. Henderson had suggested before that he take on a more formal role at Eastbrook, a mentor, someone who could guide students struggling with their own battles. At the time, the idea had felt like too much of a risk. But now, with Marcos gone and his own journey toward redemption more tangible, the notion seemed less daunting. "What if someone finds out who I used to be?" Adam asked quietly, voicing the fear that had held him back. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes kind but resolute. "We're all more than our worst mistakes, Adam. I see the man you are now, not the man you were. You've earned the right to be seen for who you've become." The words settled over him, warming him in a way he hadn't expected. In that moment, Adam realized that the fight against his past wasn't about hiding. It was about accepting his mistakes and moving forward with purpose. He nodded, the weight on his chest lifting as he finally let go of the fear that had held him prisoner for so long. "All right," he said, a hint of a smile forming on his lips. "I'll do it." Henderson's smile widened. "I think you're going to be a natural." A few weeks later, the mentorship program launched with Adam at the helm. He led small groups of students who had faced their own challenges, creating a space where they could speak freely about their fears, their struggles, and their dreams. For the first time, Adam shared parts of his own story, not the gritty details of his criminal past, but the emotions he had experienced, the loneliness, the guilt, and the journey to find redemption. Sarah and David joined the program as his first unofficial recruits. With time, Sarah grew more confident, her quiet strength inspiring others to open up. David, once wary and defensive, blossomed as a leader, helping Adam with the new students who joined the group. Together, they built a community of resilience, a family forged in trust and support. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session, Adam lingered in the empty room, his heart full as he reflected on how far he had come. The life he had now, surrounded by friends, offering support to those who needed it, was one he never thought he could deserve. As he gathered his things to leave, Sarah appeared in the doorway, a hesitant smile on her face. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside. "Of course," Adam replied, setting his bag down. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity that made his heart skip. "I wanted to say thank you for everything, for not just being there when things were bad, but for showing me and David that we could be more than our fears." Adam felt a warmth rise in his chest. "You don't owe me any thanks, Sarah. You and David have helped me as much as I've helped you. I wouldn't be here without you too." She smiled, her gaze soft. "Maybe. But we're all here now because you didn't give up. You're more than a mentor, Adam. You're family." The words hit him deeply, and for a moment he struggled to respond. Family was something he'd lost long ago, a concept he had buried with the memories of his past. But here, with Sarah and David, with Henderson's support, he felt the pieces of something he'd never thought he'd have again. A future, a place he belonged. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As she left, Adam stood alone in the quiet room, a sense of peace settling over him that was as unfamiliar as it was comforting. He had finally found his place, a purpose that went beyond his own redemption. Over the next few months, the program grew, attracting students from all walks of life. Eastbrook's campus transformed as more students found the courage to stand up against the forces that had once kept them afraid. Adam became a respected figure, someone others looked to not for his strength alone, but for his wisdom and empathy. One evening, as he walked across campus, he paused to watch the sunset casting a golden glow over the buildings. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, for Henderson's trust, for Sarah and David's friendship, for the chance to be someone better. As he walked on, he spotted David waiting near the campus fountain. The younger man approached, a wide grin on his face. "Hey, we're all grabbing some food later. You in?" Adam laughed, clapping a hand on David's shoulder. "Wouldn't miss it." They walked together, their footsteps light and unburdened. Adam no longer worried about looking over his shoulder, about shadows lurking in his past. He had faced them, and in doing so, had found the strength to reclaim his life. He was no longer Liam, the feared enforcer. He was Adam, a friend, a mentor, and a protector. As they joined Sarah and the others, laughter filled the air, and Adam felt something he hadn't dared to dream of, happiness, genuine and whole. He had come to Eastbrook seeking to disappear, to bury a life he'd thought would haunt him forever. But instead, he had found a new purpose, a second chance to be the man he had always wanted to be. And as he looked around at the people who had become his family, he knew that he'd finally found something worth fighting for, a life he could live without fear, a future that was entirely his. With a quiet smile, he embraced the path ahead, knowing that whatever challenges awaited, he was ready to face them, not as a man fleeing his past, but as one who had found the courage to build a new beginning.